Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar on safe housing for immigrant survivors of domestic violence. My name is Carlo Ng. I'm the Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. I will be your moderator. I am here today with my colleague at NASS, Jenny Herget, our Operations and Communications Manager, as well as Teresa Burns, who is the Refugio Manager at Casa de Esperanza. Today's session is being recorded. The slides and recording will be sent out 1 to 2 days after the webinar. If you have questions at any time during the webinar, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll do our best to answer your questions throughout the presentation. And if there's time, we'll also have a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. Finally, we will be referring to a number of different resources today. We've consolidated all these resources in a live Google document, which Jenny can share with you in the chat box. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a short evaluation that will pop up. We would really appreciate it if you could complete the evaluation. The evaluation also includes an option for you to request a certificate of completion if you need one, and NASH can provide you one. You don't need to email us directly for the certificate if you request one through the evaluation. Like I mentioned, I'm with the National Alliance for Safe Housing. We provide technical assistance, training, and support to advocates on housing and homelessness issues impacting domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. If you would like technical assistance support, you can visit us at www.nashta.org or send an email to my email address, which is at the end of the slides. NASH is part of the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, which is an unprecedented partnership between 4 federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. It's also a partnership with 6 national nonprofits focusing on domestic violence and sexual assault issues. The consortium was created to address the technical assistance needs at the intersection of housing, homelessness, domestic violence, and sexual assault. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Teresa.
Thank you, Carlo. Again, my name is Teresa Burns. I am the Refugio, which is a shelter manager at Casa Esperanza. Casa Esperanza is a Latina domestic violence agency. We are based out of St. Paul, Minnesota, and we really grew out of the early grassroots of the violence against women's movement in 1982. We recognize that it's the community that will end domestic violence, not any system or organization. So our mission is to mobilize the Latino community and Latinos and Latinas to end domestic violence. We really see that we do this by emphasizing developing social capital, so that's that trust, reciprocity, information, and cooperation, because we know statistically also that building social capital decreases domestic violence. Casa Esperanza has created the National Latino Network. It's a project and it's a national resource center focused on ending domestic violence and sexual assault while promoting the health and well-being of Latina communities around the country. So our main goals with the National Latino Network is education and awareness, policy advocacy, capacity building and training, and research. So kind of jumping into our topic today on safe housing for immigrant survivors, we want to create a framework, right, and be clear about what lens we're looking through. And that's that domestic violence violates human rights of survivors and their children by creating unsafe and fearful environments. Safety for survivors is central to the work that we do here as domestic violence and survivor service provider organizations, and those responding in various systems to survivors. And safety is unattainable unless we can practice cultural and linguistic competency consistent at organizational and individual levels. So where are we going today? So we're going to talk first about the realities of immigrant survivors on the larger scale, and then we are going to move into that advocating specifically for immigrant survivors and housing. So starting off with reality of many immigrant survivors, I first just want to say that these are commonalities we have seen across various immigrant communities. However, they by no means are all-encompassing, nor are they reflective in every single immigrant survivor's reality. So just be sure that obviously take all of this with a grain of salt. We're going to jump into each one of these here. So it's important to recognize that there is a great diversity of realities within each immigrant survivor. So those things are the age at which they immigrated to the United States, or whether they are second-generation immigrant in the United States, the amount of interaction they have with a mainstream culture. So do they live in a cultural city or town from their area that is mostly surrounded with people who speak their language or come from their same country? Or are they the only family in a small suburban town, right? Those realities look really different. What's also important to recognize in diversity of immigrant survivors' realities is their amount of interactions with institutions. So have they had previous interactions, or is this their first time? Any relationships that are maintained with their country of origin? Their language proficiency and educational background. Choices about customs or languages they practice in the home. So it could be that parents are also adopting a new language in the home or learning English and kind of become proficient. It could be that the heads of households are primarily monolingual and that it's really only children that are. It could be that children are primary English speakers and are not learning their language from their parents' home country. And then that reality, of course, of families with mixed immigration statuses, and of course the role of religion, spirituality, or any connection to faith-based organizations. So next, looking at the diversity, we want to recognize that each of these realities, right, of all those factors I just named, can vary by every single family member living in a household. So that can look different for a 5-year-old that's starting kindergarten, and that reality will look different from a monolingual elder living in the home. That will look different from a teenager or an older adult. And this icon is really just a reminder for us that, of course, stress looks and feels different for every person. So those dynamics in the household can vary greatly and can create an additional tension among a whole household as a unit. So going back into these realities that we see common across various immigrant communities is the importance of family, right? And I think many of us can relate to this. But for many immigrant communities, family can include generations of family members. It can also include close friends, so it may not be, does not have to be blood related. The few members of their family that are nearby may be their lifeline. Often family members are dependent on survivor, so it could be that they have elder parents in their home, or it could be that they are financially supporting relatives in other countries. And then family is also considered the core of stability and strength for many immigrant survivors. Next is interdependence. And we consider this the connection and reliability of those in your circle for support and resources, and then vice versa. So interdependence can often be a framework for viewing life and decision making. So it could be that a survivor is making a decision about whether to apply or accept a new job if they know that they can rely on their neighbor for transportation, or if they know that a cousin of theirs will watch their daughter in the evenings while they take an evening shift. So those are just examples of kind of how interdependence can look like, right? It can be monetary, it could be childcare, it could be that religious and spiritual support or prayers during a hard time. Related to that is this community support, right? Placing great value on a community, an extensive network that includes friends and neighbors of the survivor. And often immigrant survivors thrive on interaction and seek out social connections and support one another in countless ways, especially if there are only a few of those connections in their local community or once they've left their home country. This image was developed by Tapestry, and it just kind of gives an example of the rings demonstrate the various types of people, systems, and frameworks that influence our lives. Of course, with the survivor at the middle. Another common reality among immigrant survivors is respect, right? So again, many of us can understand this and relate, but elders and many people with authority are honored and respected because of the place they hold in the family and community and in history. So respect is often fundamental in family and community dynamics. It's crucial in daily contacts and relationships with your participants or your clients. What's important to remember about respect is that it can look, remembering for us to remember that respect can look different in different cultures. So that could be eye contact, it could be handshaking, and it could be use of titles too. Next is distrust of state institutions. So this one may be a little more unfamiliar for those who don't have as much experience working with immigrant populations or refugee communities, but many immigrants have fled homelands because of injustices committed by institutions or lack of protection in their countries. The examples of that could be that in their home country or community there's police brutality, corruption, there are military crackdowns, and those are all part of their personal history as survivors. Refugees also may have undergone experiences of trauma, being uprooted and displaced from their homes and relocating. So those, of course, are not necessarily when people are making economic changes or decisions to leave their homes. And then, of course, here for second and third generation immigrants born and raised here in the United States is that many, of course, are experiencing racism and other forms of prejudice from an early age. And when I talk about this slide, I always recall when I was working as a volunteer at the border in Texas at a migrant and refugee shelter. One of the women I was supporting with case management was telling me her story about how she had been kidnapped and blindfolded and beaten by a group of masked perpetrators in her community. And luckily she was released and safe afterwards. But as she began to work with a therapist, she was able to identify that one of the voices of the perpetrators was indeed actually a local law enforcement officer. So it just kind of shows this reality that many survivors come with a personal history of distrust of state institutions because, of course, in her situation, who was she supposed to seek help from? And this was the exact person that was perpetrating her that indeed was supposed to be the person she would normally be able to go to seek help and protection. Next is many immigrant communities have a deference to authority. And what we see that is really seeing trained professionals as holding highly valued and special knowledge. It definitely interrelates with respect. So a deference also could be, can cause immigrant survivors to agree hastily to a professional's suggestions or not to ask questions. So this is really important for us to remember. I'm coming, of course, from an advocacy perspective, but recognizing that we want to assist survivors to evaluate their pros and cons and the risks and advantages of making decisions and maybe helping them walk through that decision-making process. An example of that is that, for example, we have often survivors here that file a police report, but then the police officer or call the police and the police officer tells them you need to go get an order for protection. And out of respect or deference to a police officer telling them that, they may come to us as an advocacy organization saying, I want an order for protection. And so as advocates, of course, we explain to them how the order works. We want to allow them to ask questions. But as we really discuss more and more, some of these concerns come to the surface. So it could be that they're concerned about retaliation, and often for immigrant survivors that could look like they end up deciding not to seek an order for protection because they have credible fears for the safety of family members abroad, right? And their perpetrators' connections with their family abroad, or it could be that if they have any gang relations in their home community, that they're concerned about that, right? We've also had examples of survivors who have dismissed protective orders because of the misunderstanding of what a civil protective order is. It does not have criminal charges. It certainly can lead to criminal action, right, if it's violated, but just seeking a civil protection order itself does not come with any criminal charges. But because immigrant survivors are dealing with and trying to explain this, often over social media or over the phone with extended family and friends, we have seen survivors come back and dismiss orders for protection because they've been pressured and harassed by family or friends abroad or over social media. Next is community norms. So again, going back to cultural gender norms, it could be that women's roles are more related to caretaking or remaining in the home. Of course, male gender norms, traditional male gender norms of either being the breadwinner, sometimes to the extent of there being a level of ownership of a family, and any honor and shame that are agreed upon or understood in a cultural context. And of course, again, just a reminder that these norms vary greatly within each immigrant community, but overall, some form of them often exist or may be related to those. The next I want to talk about, so those were kind of some overall norms that we've seen, and we want to talk about then what are barriers to accessing services, right? So you'll see there's a list here, and going into some practical factors, we want to identify, I want to take a quick question for you guys to be able to type into the chat box, and I'm going to ask, just even based on this list, might give you some ideas, but are there any other barriers that you see in your communities, or how do you see these barriers playing out in your own communities? And I'll just wait a minute and people can present here or can type into the group chat. Great, yeah, I see responses coming in. You can tell a lot of you are typing. Yeah, this is great. Fear of removal, economic barriers, right? Lack of support from family or community, not seeking shelter. Yep, family dynamics. So I'm going to start. Thank you. You can continue typing in your chat. I think it's great for those of us to be able to share amongst each other to identify what those are looking like in communities across the country here. So some practical factors that I want to address about immigrant communities is survivors may face difficulties accessing protection and services due to isolation. That could be from their abusive partner. It's also that lack of knowledge of resources and rights, being not in a home country, or lack of language access to know what those rights and areas are. It could be lack of support from their network. And then cultural factors that come into play, right? Survivors may not seek assistance due to cultural perceptions of law enforcement, right? Also playing back to that historical trauma, perceptions of court system, of what outside of assistance looks like, cultural perspectives of divorce or domestic violence or sexual assault, or those things being excused maybe in their culture or overlooked. And it could be that they have fear of disgrace, could be also religious pressure or norms. And then we also have survivors' economic factors, right? Survivors are often economically dependent on the person using abuse or don't have work authorization. Some other legal factors are survivors often don't report abuse because of fear of deportation. And I want to be explicit that fear of deportation really often is regardless of status. So it could be that somebody has legal permanent residency here in the United States and they are still in fear of deportation, or that of other family members, right, mixed status households. It could be that they are in fear of loss of custody of their children, right? That's often a tool that an abusive partner uses against an immigrant survivor. Could be that, right, legal fear of retaliation from an abuser. That could be withholding documents. That could be not filing for immigration relief that they had originally said that they would going to, or if they are in petitions that involve each other, it could be related to that. So immigration-related forms of abuse are very pervasive in the realities of immigrant survivors. Lastly, I'll note here that immigrant victims may also have concerns about causing deportation of their abusive partner or perpetrator, right? Because of either the impact and what that means financially for them, economically, familially. I'll note also that for immigrant survivors, access to shelter or right, crisis centers or talking with a lawyer, right, while they're living with an abusive partner may be extremely unlikely. Access to a restraining order, again, also unlikely. And then access to police or law enforcement. They might access it, especially if an abusive partner is eventually convicted of a crime, right? They might be more likely, but there's so many of those dynamics, again, that we talked about previously that kind of are contributing layers of thought processes that are coming into play in immigrant survivors' decision making. And then lastly, I'll just note too that immigrant victims may certainly improve their immigration status by cooperating with law enforcement. So that's obviously helpful for advocates to be aware of, are the options of U visa and the VAWA self-petitions and T visas. Those are all forms of immigration relief as a immigrant survivor, if they are a victim of a crime here in the United States. Those are options to explore. And there was a webinar yesterday with my colleagues that digs more into that, and there will plenty of resources available for you to find out more information if you're not already familiar with those. Many of you may be familiar, of course, with a power and control wheel. If you're not already, there have been multiple versions. Of course, the power and control wheel was created by the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota, by Futures Without Violence, and the Immigration Power and Control Wheel was adapted by Futures Without Violence. And really, I encourage you, we're not going to go over all of the details here, but I encourage you to become familiar with some of the tactics that people using abuse may be utilizing against immigrant survivors. And those overlap a lot here and come into play when we look at an immigrant survivor's realities. We need to recognize that there are life-generated risks. So again, that could be the isolation from family that's living abroad, by system-generated risk. So again, that an example of that could be lack of trust with law enforcement. And then there's that abuse-generated risk based on those tactics mentioned in the power and control wheel. So it's important as advocates and service providers to see, okay, what are the barriers that this survivor is facing? And what are these overlapping risks? Where do they kind of fall in this diagram? And then recognizing, of course, that our response as service providers and advocates is to safety plan around not only abuse-generated risks, but also those life-generated risks and system-generated risks, taking that holistic perspective. So it's also important for us to recognize that for many immigrant survivors, and of course survivors in general, violence is not always the only, nor often the most pressing challenge that they may be facing at this time. What that means is that there could be other realities that seem to be more urgent. So it could be that they have a child with special needs, that they are trying to make sure that they are getting sufficient education, right, and equal education access, right? It could be that they are struggling with mental health. It could be that they're more concerned about being able to pay rent at the end of the month, right, living paycheck to paycheck. So other issues that are impacting immigrant survivors are certainly immigration. So again, as we mentioned, that fear of deportation and lack of access to services or lack of information about services. We know statistically that immigrant survivors are often in fear of calling the police in emergency cases, and that children of undocumented immigrants may be more likely to remain in abusive homes due to a parent's fear of deportation. And then obviously in many communities right now there's a heightened sense of immigration enforcement policies and realities of what that's looking like. So accessing law enforcement may not feel safe for an immigrant survivor. It could be that they have limited access to services. So it could be that based on the composition of their household, that if it's a mixed status family, they don't qualify for other public services, or they have lack of knowledge about resources available. They have limited access to economic assistance, health care, insurance, higher education. And then due to documentation status, right, many immigrant families don't have access to assistance programs such as food stamps or Medicaid. We know that research shows that welfare agencies are also less likely to receive federal funding for immigrant youth. And then, of course, financial resources. So it could be lack of basic needs. It could be that they're living in challenging, poor, or unsafe living conditions. They're limited economically and financially. It could be that, of course, we know that poverty has been found to predict higher levels of child abuse and neglect because of tensions in the home. And we know family is often the core of, and I'll use the example of Latino communities, where Latinos often come from a collective mindset as the familia or family as a whole, rather than choosing individual from an individualistic perspective. So separation from extended family can create a lack of social support networks due to isolation and instability and separation physically as well as emotionally. And then, of course, going back again to language and cultural barriers. Again, mentioning mental health, apart from what many survivors experience as anxiety or depression, coping skills, these can all be contributing factors to with immigrant survivors, as well as any of those historical traumas that they might have been bringing from their home countries. And with mental health, I also want to take a moment to recognize that cultural beliefs and understandings of mental health really vary greatly in immigrant communities and in other countries. So, for example, I will say that often in Latino communities, if somebody goes to see a therapist, it's because you're loca, it's because you're crazy. So that those implications of seeking out mental health resources often come with some often cultural barriers also. But then even if somebody is willing to access mental health services, are they culturally relevant? Do they have access to therapists that speak their primary language, or are they consistently needing to use interpreters? Are their mental health agencies equipped and ready to utilize interpreters or to seek out staff that have that language access and cultural understanding? The last one I'll mention here is education. So many immigrant survivors have limited educational opportunities both in their home countries and here in the United States. And what that might look like here in the United States, for example, is that it could be that a parent feels that their child who is now being placed in an ELL, or English learner language program, or ELL programs, are now going to be placed in that track throughout the rest of their education. And it could be that a parent, or based on how an education system is set up, that could be that that's under-resourced, that there's not enough staffing, and a child is not getting the attention that they hope or need for, or it's a different level of education and material. So it could also be that immigrant youth and even adults have difficulties accessing or affording higher education degrees or certifications. And then any education that they are bringing from their home country often is not credited here in the United States. And I'll just give you this example. Recently in our shelter, we just had a Latina who has the equivalent of a master's degree in architecture from her home country, and none of the credits can transfer here into the United States. So she was at a point of, she was already in a bachelor's program to start her education over here in the United States, forcing her to be financially dependent on an abusive partner with a few small children that were not in schools yet, so needing to afford or find scholarships for daycare, and no access to a car for transportation, and so also relying on public transportation. So just an example, too, of where education kind of comes into play with those things, too, because it could be often that immigrants are working in storefronts or cleaning or hospitality businesses, and often the assumption is that they do not have higher education, but that's not always the case. Many often do have education or certifications or degrees from their home countries, but are not able to apply them or transfer some of that here into the United States, limiting their economic potential here too. So that was a lot of information. All that being said, I want to lift up the strengths of the immigrant communities, right, and immigrant survivors, and that's their resiliency. So despite their experiences of abuse and barriers they're faced, immigrant survivors often heal and lead thriving lives. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with statistics of just how great the contributions are of immigrant survivors here in the United States. All right, we're going to jump back to our roadmap here. So we've kind of just covered talking all about realities on the large scale of immigrant survivors. Next, I want to transition into really talking about what does this look like in terms of advocating for immigrant survivors as it relates to housing. And I want to assure you too also that any questions that you're putting in the chat, Carlo will respond to as she is able, or will be tracking the questions, and if there's time at the end, we will be opening some Q&As. All right, so talking about realities of immigrant survivors with accessing housing here in the United States. There's a number of realities that come into play, and of course the first is language access. So what does that look like? It could be that identifying opportunities, right? So either websites or newspapers or just any general information about housing often is only available in English. but then also at that point of accessing housing of saying, okay, language access in terms of they want to set up an appointment. So does the landlord speak the language? Do they have somebody in their network that's willing and able to assist them to call and make an appointment if they're a monolingual speaker? And then, of course, completing applications in English or starting and having those conversations with landlords. Next would be credit history. So immigrant survivors, many or those who are new to the country are often unfamiliar with this credit system that we have created here in the United States. Immigrant survivors often don't know if they have a credit score, or if they do have a score, they don't know what it is. They don't know how to access it. Those who are working here in the United States that have filed for an ITIN number, that's an individual tax identification number, which is available to people to apply for without a social security number and allows them to file taxes. But many people don't know that with an ITIN number, you also have a credit score if that person has utilized that ITIN to acquire assets. So they may not know that they have a credit score if they've been using an ITIN. And then, of course, credit history in terms of abuse, we talk about it could be that an abusive partner has taken out credit cards or racked up debt unbeknownst to a survivor. So that could be through their marriage, it could be through housing history. Next, housing history. So this is often immigrant survivors are living in shared living environments. So again, with that familia, recognizing that it's larger often than just blood relatives. It could be that they're living with family and friends. Often it does not necessarily require a lease or a sublease. It's just a verbal agreement that you can stay here so long as you're paying for this or you're doing this. And then people living with previously, the housing history becomes an issue sometimes when they are seeking to apply for a new apartment and they need to provide a housing history of where they have lived, or to if they are working with a coordinated entry system or HUD-funded housing, often they require a housing history. But it could be that the person that they were previously living with is unwilling or unable to provide them with housing verification. If it's a housing program that does require housing history and it's government funded, often if they've been living with other immigrants, those people are in fear of providing information to the government. And then it also could be for many immigrant survivors, this would be their first time renting as a primary leaseholder. So they don't have a formal housing history in the way that many people are looking for that information. It also could be, again, as it relates to abuse, is that their partner has left mortgage or rent unpaid, again, unbeknownst to the survivor. And then we can talk about income, and financial security. So many market rate apartments seek 2, even 3 times the rent that you make the income, which of course is the ideal, that somebody is only paying 30% or a third of their income towards rent. Many cities and many communities, that is not realistic or reality based on what people are earning as minimum wage workers. So access to finances for deposits and a first month's rent, having sufficient income to even qualify to access market rate housing are barriers, as well as it could be that they have limited access to public benefits that often help with a first month's rent or with a deposit. So many immigrant survivors are afraid of seeking emergency assistance because of public charge. And again, that could be regardless of their status. That could be misinformation. That could be, it could be that they don't qualify, or that public charge does not apply to them. So the sufficient income and financial security are obviously barriers and realities for immigrant survivors. And lastly, I'll note background checks. So right now, many, at least here in our community, many landlords are switching to online applications for apartments, which often require a social security number, and that's a required field. So you already get set up sort of with this failure if you go on to an online application, and if you don't have a social security number, you either have to decide to put something in there. I'm not saying a false number, but it could be zeros or X's. But even if you try to talk with a landlord directly, they could say that they're unwilling to, they need the security number in order to process a background check, and that they're unwilling to process an application without a social security number because they don't know how to do a background check without it, right? Because many of them just contract an online company that processes the background checks. Again, also fear with background checks is mixed status households. So it could be that people that they're living with or being supported with don't feel comfortable getting a background check, or it's unsafe for them to do so. And then most immigrant survivors are either often undocumented or in the process of adjusting status, either through their family members, it could be through their abusive partner, or it certainly could be as a result of the abuse, like I mentioned, either a U visa, a T visa, or the VAWA self-petition. So those are a lot of realities to look at within trying to even just access housing with the immigrant survivor community. So I'm going to next share with you some ways that Casa Esperanza and our other partners have found in working directly with immigrant survivors that we have found effective in being able to find, apply for, and maintain safe housing. So starting step one, right, just finding housing. Some practical tips that we have done and the creative advocacy we've done is we really look for housing opportunities in places where we know that immigrant communities gather. So what does that look like for us? That's those cultural food markets. It could be cultural or community newspapers, magazines, websites, online forums. We have an advocate that often finds housing just on Facebook, so she's part of a number of social media groups in her area, and or those neighborhood groups, even apps now that are similar to like the Nextdoor app, is where people from the same neighborhood are starting to share information, is that those often exist within cultural communities too, but for larger organizations, you may need to do some finding or to start asking around of saying, where do those exist, so that you can support survivors to look for them. And then also faith organizations. Another option would be connecting with friends or community members with shared values to look for shared housing. So seeking, for example, I always give that we have had residents of our shelter actually leave and move into housing together. So they obviously have found that they get along well, and they have mutually agreed that one is going to do childcare while the other one goes to work. And then they agree on how much is getting paid towards rent and who is paying for groceries, and they have found mutually beneficial agreements. Of course, that doesn't work for everybody. But again, when we talk about kind of people with shared values, it could be that there's a parent group, or it could be often we look to religious communities, and we have worked with participants and survivors to supported them in talking with, could be religious leaders in that community or of that congregation, because often those key leaders in the community will know somebody who is willing or available to rent or offer space to a survivor, either temporary or long-term. So connecting with other people in communities that have those shared values. And then I note on here too that agree on confidentiality or disclosure beforehand. And what this means is because we're kind of going out into community, right? So looking into places at markets and with religious leaders, it's important, of course, for advocates to be in agreement with the survivor ahead of time as to what they will or will not disclose. It's, of course, always an option for a survivor to appeal to the human side, right, of another person, right? And so many people are compassionate and want to be able to support a survivor, and sometimes being able to express a little bit of their history may help them create that trust and to establish a relationship. But of course, that's not safe in all situations. So of course, let the survivor lead and determine, but as advocates or service providers, it's okay to notify survivors that, it's up to you. You can certainly, if you want to share that information, I'll support with you that, or I'm only going to say what you want me to say, right? Next, again, with finding housing, some other opportunities are, or ways that we have found that we've been able to find housing with survivors is just accompaniment. So Casa Esperanza does have our shelter, but all of our advocates we consider as community advocates, and what that looks like for us is that we call them mobile advocates, in that they go with participants, they accompany them to appointments until they have established competence in accessing that resource on their own. So it could be that they're learning to use the bus for the first time, but again, it's that sometimes it's when somebody in that perspective of it's their first time going to meet with a landlord or going to look at housing. Just having that second set of eyes even can be a huge support, right? So helping a survivor think through safety planning in a potential space, or often survivors may be really closed off to the idea of moving into housing on their own, or have stereotypes or perceptions that they are trying to manage with in the potential of looking at a new living space. And so having an advocate's perspective to be able to, again, help them view that holistic view of the pros and cons can really assist them to make decisions. And then I would say next with that there's an opportunity to find housing by building community relationships, right, and not enemies. And what I mean by that is really looking into the utilizing the public health perspective. So one example of this is that there's a DV agency here in Minnesota that has started hosting open houses for landlords. And it's titled, "How Can I Support My Tenants Experiencing Domestic Violence?" And so it really gives with this approach of reaching out to other members of community as a domestic violence organization. They're reaching out to landlords saying, we can support you because we all agree that we don't want violence in homes. And then that organization, of course, has the opportunity to not only equip landlords with information and resources, but also building partnerships for future collaboration or future referral into their units. And along with that, of course, goes that opportunity with debunking domestic violence myths. So I use this example of, I was talking with a landlord and I was explaining my work with them and how we provide some rent assistance to participants who are often leaving shelter. And I said, would you guys be open to accepting third-party checks if we were to refer somebody to your program? And the landlord said to me, well, do you ever have issues with the abusers like coming and causing issues on the property? And I took a step back and I just said, well, of course I can think of one situation that has happened. However, statistically speaking, like 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence, but it can look different. So that reality is that I can tell you, you already have tenants who are experiencing and who are survivors of domestic violence. And the landlord then kind of, had a light bulb moment of saying like, oh yeah, I guess you're right. I don't know that it's going on. And I was like, yeah, that's right. And that's true for the vast majority of survivors that aren't having issues necessarily that are noticeable to the outside world, right? The abuse is mostly happening behind closed doors. So using those opportunities then and statistics to debunk domestic violence in the perspective of landlords. And then, of course, identifying champion landlords. So if you work with any transitional housing programs or do any scattered site referrals, or even just in your personal networks, if you know landlords who are willing and able to work with survivors or people coming out of shelter, this is a great opportunity to leverage that relationship. So asking them, can you connect me with other landlords that you know? And then, or are you willing to be a reference so that we are looking to partner with another property management company? Can I list you as a reference so that they can be assured that this support and this referral network has worked well for us? So those are some ideas on how to create or how to find housing and support too with immigrant survivors. And of course, what I'll say at the end of this too is always trust the participant, right, and the survivor in where they were leaning towards housing, right? So it could be that they really feel insecure about the price of a unit and the viability of affording that long term. Or it could be that they already have somewhere in mind, which maybe in the mind of the advocate is not a safe neighborhood or is not very, it could be that they have concerns about the cleanliness of the unit. But at the end of the day, we want the survivor, of course, to take the lead because they probably have already identified that they have friends living in a certain area or that they are able to identify an existing support or to build their support network in a certain area, or that access to social capital. So it could be that it's close to their children's school and that is their primary goal, or that it's nearby to a bus line, so it's easy for them to get to work, which means that by reducing their commute time, they are able to get home sooner to spend time with their children. So that can look like a lot of different ways, but of course, putting the emphasis and the trust back on the survivor to lead. And I please invite you to share any other ideas that you have in the chat here too. Of course, we are a community and want to share these. So anything that I haven't mentioned that has worked and been successful for you with your program or initiative or survivors you've supported, any novel ideas, please feel free to include them in the chat too so that we can all share that knowledge. All right, so next I'm going to kind of dig into applying for housing. So how do we address some of those barriers and challenges that we identified when it comes to applying for housing? And the first ideas that I'll share with you are letters of guarantee. So often a survivor, especially if they're new to housing or if they have bad credit or don't have a housing history, often as advocates we are trying to support the survivor to access housing, but the landlord may, at the end of the day, just feel really uneasy about it, right? Of saying, this is a high-risk tenant. It sounds like it's likely that the unit's going to turn over. It sounds likely that they're not going to be able to pay rent on time. And often, so what I say with letters of guarantee is that sometimes the formality as a service provider, the formality of providing something on letterhead can make all the difference. So we often provide our participants we are prepared to assist either with paying for a deposit or assisting them even just with $100 towards their rent. We will be providing a check that is written to the property management company or to the landlord. And sometimes even just with that letter of guarantee from the agency that says we are a nonprofit organization and we are trying to help so-and-so establish a housing history and to be a successful tenant. We are working with them in providing financial advocacy to them. A lot of that gives confidence to landlords of saying, okay, this person is not on their own. They have resources that they can access if they get into a pinch, right, or if something happens. And just that formality often, like I said, of providing something written on letterhead has really worked magic for us in some situations. It just kind of brings in that formal aspect that just a verbal conversation can't reach. Next is reference letters. So again, reference letters can be for the tenant. So it could be that, again, they were previously living somewhere but didn't have a contract or weren't on the lease. So asking for their housemates or for the people that they were paying rent to write them a very brief letter that just says they were on time and they were trustworthy and respectful. Could be, helps build that character in the eyes of the landlord. It's also for us as agencies, we utilize this also, like I said, utilizing champion landlords, asking if they will be a reference for Casa Esperanza as an agency to build a partnership with another landlord who we have not established a relationship with yet. And then providing alternate forms of income verification. So many landlords require just copies of pay stubs right from the past 2 or 3 months. But for immigrant survivors, that's not always a reality or accessible because they're not getting paid by direct deposit, or they're not getting checks, they're getting paid cash. And so we have worked with landlords or asked if we can offer these other forms of income verification other than those pay stubs. And so that could be that if they're getting paid cash is helping the participant to access bank statements that show that they are making a weekly deposit of that cash, or going to their employer and asking, or even we have as advocacy organizations asked and assisted, could be whoever their employer is, to write a very basic letter that says, Lucia is an employee of mine, and on average she works 30 to 50 hours a week, and I pay her at this hourly rate. So that could work well for people who are working temporary positions or temp jobs or flexible schedule jobs, right, where their paychecks or their income vary from week to week or month to month, but being able to provide sort of that average and large scale letter from the employer. And what I mean too as advocates of saying, literally, I have sat on the phone with an employer because it could be that this employer doesn't, is also like just paying people in cash. It could be that they're just setting up a food stand. It could be, so it could be, employment rate looks very formal and informal. So if it's an informal employer that is paying an immigrant survivor, I have literally sat on the phone with that employer and I have typed out the letter. The survivor brings them the letter, they sign it, and we bring it back and hand it to a landlord. So it's just taking that time and the steps to look for these alternatives and working with landlords to say, we'd be happy to show income verification. Would you accept a letter from the employer instead of pay stubs, because income just varies a little bit, or she doesn't have a bank account, so she's not receiving direct deposit. And then similar to that is providing alternatives for background checks. This one is definitely tricky and definitely varies based on your community, but I wanted to share this as an example. So again, with those barriers with the Social Security number, this can often is barriers for market rate housing or very formalized applications for housing. But so the background check can often be a barrier. What I'll say is, as advocacy agencies, I think we have the ability to explore partnerships and resources available with our law enforcement communities to be able to provide alternate forms of background checks. So it doesn't have to be that a survivor provides a Social Security number in order for a landlord to process a background check through one of these online companies. Rather, I'll give you the example here in Minnesota. Our Bureau of Criminal Apprehension will provide a background check for $7, and they will provide it to you within 20 minutes of walking in. And you can, in order for them to do that background check, you just simply need to show any ID. It does not need to be a state-issued ID or a U.S. government-issued ID. And then any other versions or past versions of your name. So if you've been married and had a name change, or when you came to the United States, something changed in the spelling, being able to share any of your previous names. And then they will give you a card, a letter, and it says it's for a whole state record check, a criminal background check, of your entire state record. So of course, if we would be able to provide that to a landlord of saying, can I provide you with a state background check rather than you running the online form, many of them may be willing to accept that. But again, I would put a big caution here saying this varies, of course, by the safety within each community and relationships with law enforcement agencies. So if you want to explore this in your community, as advocates, I recommend that you be sure you know exactly what to expect of the process. I often would recommend send a staff person to test it out first before sending any immigrant survivor. Certainly then, if you are aware of the risks and potential risks of involving law enforcement maybe to access that background check, is then ensuring, of course, that there is language access and or providing accompaniment, right? That safety assurance of making sure that people know where they're going and aren't in fear or concerned, and to help them reach that goal. And lastly on this, applying for housing, I'll note, always read the fine print. So one, we are very aware that immigrant survivors are vulnerable populations to shark landlords. So people who are intentionally trying to take advantage of others through property management. So we've seen shark landlords who increase late fees on a monthly basis. So if you've paid late more than once, you, rather than a $50 charge, now it's $75, or now it's $100 late fee. Or that they require more than a first month's rent as a deposit. It could be that they want the first and last deposit. So really just making sure that our participants and survivors that we're working with are accessing fair housing and not feeling susceptible to. And I'll use this example too because it stands out drastically in my mind as one of our advocates took a survivor in and was supporting with interpreting for an appointment for her to sign her lease. And as they were reviewing the lease, they took the time and reviewed all of the fine print so that the participant was fully aware of what they were agreeing to on a legal basis. And then two, they noticed and they were able to state to the landlord the late fee was marked as $800. And that, of course, and that $800 was, of course, actually what the rent was. So we are giving the landlord the benefit of the doubt that it was a typo, but had there been any issues in the future, that document could have held in court and saying, well, you read it and you agreed to it. So we, of course, don't want to put anybody in that sort of vulnerable position. And so, of course, they were able to edit it then. But I use that as an extreme example because what a terrible predicament that would have created had something gone wrong with the lease and they were going to charge a late fee. All right, next we've kind of done finding housing, applying for housing, and now we're in the housing, okay, and saying what can we do to support the survivors that we're working with to maintain their safe housing. So first I'll say get verbal agreements in writing. So often, and this is incredible that landlords are willing often to make, agreeing for participants to make partial rent payments or to make rent payment after the date on the lease that's indicated on the lease because they're either waiting for their cash assistance to come in or their paycheck comes on the 10th, and so they're always a little behind or delayed if they are kind of working on a month-to-month budget. But getting those verbal agreements in writing, and I say at the bare minimum between an advocate and the landlord in an email, can be really helpful. But ideally, right, it's typed out and they agree to it. And I just say that too because, of course, we've run into issues then where a landlord says one thing and then, 8 months down the road, they say, I never said that. Or a different management company can come in and all of a sudden that agreement no longer stands. And related to that, of course, is as advocates, we can really assist to clear up any miscommunications that happen between the tenant and the landlord. And we have seen this most with maintenance requests being made in the apartment. So as advocates, we are being really clear with participants about the procedure to make a maintenance request in their unit and their rights to request maintenance repairs and enforce that they get done, right? So sometimes we get landlords that, you know, the participant, their survivor knows how to make the request, but is not, the maintenance isn't getting done. And then what happens then is that when that gets unaddressed over time and the tenant or the survivor leaves the unit, then the management company comes back and says, oh, you're not getting your deposit back because there was this X, Y, and Z damage. And so we want to avoid that, right? And we want to support the survivors we're supporting to be good tenants. And then, so what that looks like too is then, of course, advocating with and for participants when maintenance is being disregarded. So here in Minnesota, maintenance needs to be, any maintenance request needs to be responded to within 14 days. And we have a tenant resource hotline that supplies people with forms and information, and so our advocates will assist a participant to fill out the maintenance warning, which is basically for landlords saying it has been 14 days since I submitted this request. Please make this change immediately, or this repair immediately. So again, building that accountability too, but then any miscommunications, right? So it could be that about those late payments or any verbal agreements they've made, getting that in writing, but also as advocates, right, really lending out a hand saying, how can we avoid this in the future? Or what would work best if this tenant has a question in the future? What's the best way to reach you? And being clear then on both parties of that clear communication. You know, and I'll use the example also is that we know many landlords now are switching to mobile banking and mobile rent payments, which can be barriers for immigrant survivors, either by the technology barrier, the language access, and that access to either bank accounts that do those kind of direct transfers. So the any of those can create barriers for immigrant survivors. So working with landlords to say, you know, if so-and-so doesn't have a bank account, what other forms of payment will you accept? And again, if possible, get that in writing, that they'll accept those forms of pay, period. And then obviously supporting the survivors we're working with to know that when rent is due, of course. So being aware of grace periods. So many landlords say rent is due on the 1st, however, we'll give you until the 3rd or until the 5th. But being really clear of saying, is that close of business? Is that when the office closes at 5 p.m. or is that midnight? Right? So survivors that are working different shift schedules, making sure that they can plan accordingly to meet those requirements. And lastly, I'll say for maintaining housing is familiarizing yourselves with and offer information and resources both to landlords and survivors. But when I say familiarize and offer information and resources to landlords, that can look a few different ways. So one, with that example of the other DV agency that was hosting open houses, right, to landlords to explain how can they support tenants experiencing domestic violence. It's informing them and making landlords aware that they can be collaborators in this public health approach to end domestic violence by, it could be notifying the landlord that they have the right to trespass an abusive visitor or somebody that's causing issues on their property, right? And sometimes, too, that's a good tactic for advocates because if the survivor seeking or the survivor is experiencing abuse but doesn't want to involve law enforcement or doesn't want to seek a civil protective order, asking the landlord to trespass that person could be a good way to sort of shift some of that burden off of the survivor, right? And making, having somebody else be an intermediary or enforcing, right, a law in between the survivor and the person using abuse. Of course, too, with safety, we'll talk next about advocacy within safety here. And where this is coming down, this is we're close down to the end of the presentation. But so in terms of safety within housing, we want to support immigrant survivors to get to know neighbors. Honestly, as advocates, we are able to offer and assist people to do meet and greets and just encourage them, and maybe with our support of being physically present there, of knocking on the 3 doors surrounding their unit and saying, you know, I just moved in, I just wanted to introduce myself and wanted to let you know this is my name and I'm in this unit. But then, you know, knowing then who is around them so that they're both familiar by face but also potential supports in the future. And that can look like also safety planning with children, of course. So, right, knowing as children move into safe housing or new housing is helping the survivor to notify them who they can and cannot let into a unit, what they should be paying attention to, like doors locking behind them. And then certainly of like who children can ask for help in a situation of abuse in terms of physical safety. So that's, again, that knowledge of knowing who some of the neighbors are or how to access the landlord, safe people in their units or buildings or neighbors nearby that they can go to ask for help. It could be also sharing safety plans with a champion landlord if it's desired or helpful, right, for survivors. So some landlords are really supportive when a survivor has a civil protective order, and you don't have to share the full order with them, right, that has all the details of abuse. Often you can just share certain pages of the final order that say this person is not supposed to come to this address or needs to remain at a distant level, because it could be security guards, right, or landlords that are around the property. It could be the property management or the people who are doing yard maintenance, is building those partnerships with people and establishing some trust of saying, yeah, we're all looking out for this and we all want you to stay safe. And then in regards to protective orders, or excuse me, doors, alarms, and bells and cameras, you know, there's so much great technology now with those doorbell cameras that we can often, as victim service providers, assist survivors in getting, and they are a lot more affordable now than formal security systems used to be. But sometimes even that, because some of them still cost a few $100s, even that can be too much of a cost for immigrant survivors. And the reason I put bells on that list is that I love this idea. One of the advocates on our team went to the dollar store and bought a handful of bells and went to her participant's house, and they together strung these bells on a string and taped them to the windows of the house she was renting, because her partner had a habit of forcing the windows open. So they literally would string the bells, these dollar store bells, across the windows. And what that did then is when anybody was trying to force the window, the survivor knew and had time then to either call law enforcement or to leave the house out the other entrance. And I just think that's such a great idea, because it was so simple and very financially affordable, but can make a really big difference in somebody's physical safety also. And then, of course, safety and housing right is in protective orders, which this is all information most of you are already going to know. But with immigrant survivors, too, I often include knowledge, or I think it's important to think about with survivors of when they're moving into a new unit, you can think about if your state or any programs have address confidentiality programs. Before moving in or before signing the lease to a program is often the time to do it, because after signing the lease, they're also signing off their name on getting mail, and their address gets sold, and name and address gets sold to other advertisers and solicitors. So before signing the lease is a critical time to look at address confidentiality. And then in regards to protective orders, again, evaluating the pros and cons of keeping an address confidential, either on an existing or a new protective order. So, for example, in Minnesota, we've seen, or in my experience, we've seen some issues with law enforcement not making reports on protective order violations when an address has been confidential, because the partner, of course, claims they didn't know that the survivor lived there. And I'm like waving my hands in the air right now. But yeah, so they will notify law enforcement, the partner will show up, the law enforcement will show up, the partner will say, I didn't know they lived here. I didn't know that the order was in place, or I didn't know that they lived here. I was just trying to visit a friend, or I was coming to see if there's a unit available, whatever excuse they might come up with. So if a survivor, so here are things to consider as advocates or service providers, is that if the survivor knows and really has this gut instinct that this person's just has a knack for finding them, or is stalking them, or will likely do anything they can to find out where they're living, it might be worth putting a new address into the protective order, or certainly once that person discovers where they are now living in safe housing, is then working with the survivor to go back and make a modification to that order so that they don't run into any issues to report violations in the future. And then knowing tenant rights and local tenant resources. So for example, in Minnesota, we have a great tenant hotline that's available for, it's available, they have multiple languages and interpreters available for tenants, regardless of whether they're on a lease or not, to access free legal consultation in regards to their rights as tenants and walking through. So those are things, like I said, anything from those maintenance repair requests to verbal agreements to, like I said, even if they're not on a lease, they still have some housing rights. So being familiar with those in your local resource and making sure that both the survivor is aware of them and that you or your agency is aware of them and can direct people to them. Right, and also in terms of tenant rights is any state or federal laws that allow them to break a lease. So Minnesota has a domestic violence law that allows for survivors of domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking to break a lease in the same month that they are living and to not pay whatever that penalty is of either an additional 2 months or to give a 2 months notice. They lose their deposit, but they are able to leave. They're able to stay in the unit for the month that they have already paid for, and they do not need to pay any future months. And they are able to leave without any penalty or eviction or any legal process coming against them. And then, of course, when we are talking about HUD-funded housing or Section 8 vouchers, is being aware of VAWA protections that are in place, so those emergency transfers that are available, again, without any penalties towards the survivors. And, of course, right, as advocates, being aware that it's illegal for landlords to threaten to evict people or to evict them, for tenants to call the police for their own safety. So making sure that sort of, obviously, the survivor is aware of that, but then also, if and when needed, being aware of what resources, tenant resources are available to them in the long term. And again, simple aspect too of changing locks. Again, that partnership with the landlords of saying, you know, so-and-so would really benefit from changing the locks. You know, and that's, again, the agreement of how much the survivor and the advocate choose or mutually agree upon, or the survivor agrees that they want the advocate to share. Because it could be explaining, you know, there was an incident last week and so stole her purse that had a copy of their keys in it, and you know, they really don't feel safe unless they're able to change locks, and many victim service and government agencies have funds to help pay for that. Or if there's insufficient locks, so if it's just one deadbolt lock, or if a survivor would like to have a chain lock or block lock on the door also, is working with the landlord to see what options those are. So those are great ideas. Again, I invite you to include any other great advocacy examples you guys have done within your own programs or agencies, to include them in the chat and share resources with each other. This list, of course, is not exhaustive, but I hope it has given you a number of ideas to be able to respond and seeking safe housing for immigrant survivors. So just a broad overview again. So how, as agencies, should we address these barriers? And that includes building organizational capacity. So training your advocacy or social worker staff on the realities of immigrant survivors, including information and making sure they're aware of housing laws that are in place and any housing laws that are specific to survivors, and any laws that relate to immigrant, right? Being familiar with immigrant and immigration law to any survivors. Again, I'll refer back to that resources to the webinar that was hosted yesterday and will be available later next week about legal protections for immigrant survivors. And then really focusing to immigrant survivors is using a strength-based lens. So it could be easy for all of us to fall into the mindset that immigrant survivors have so many barriers or so many systematic barriers, but really at the end of the day is empowering the survivors to utilize the strengths that they have to overcome those barriers. Remembering those diverse realities, right, of not assuming that anybody has one specific experience in their lived realities as an immigrant survivor. And all of that can be done by building rapport and a relationship of trust, both as advocates and survivors, between advocates and survivors, but then encouraging and supporting a survivor to build rapport and a relationship of trust with their housing provider. And the last thing I want to leave you with is this quote from one of the directors, former director of Casa Esperanza, who was really transformative in how we did our Latina advocacy. And she would always say, when you start with problems, you create programs. But when you start with strengths, you create opportunities. So just being really aware of how our language and our lens of how we are approaching survivors impacts the opportunities we are creating for them. And this is just an example, too, that the Minnesota coalition of agencies, domestic violence and sexual assault agencies called Violence Free Minnesota, developed a few years ago, being open and sharing with all programs of making sure that immigrant survivors are aware that they can access your services as domestic violence agencies, as sexual assault agencies, rape crisis centers, pro bono law, just being able to do some campaigning too. So this, of course, was available in multiple languages, but being able to explicitly welcome any immigrant survivors to access their services can make a huge difference in terms of outreach in the community too. So here you'll get a copy of the webinar. There are a number of resources, both for organizations and then also for safety. And as Carlo mentioned, they are also going to be sending out a link to, or in the chat is a link to a Google spreadsheet that my colleagues have put together too of resources for to address safe housing for immigrant survivors and legal protections. And with that, I wanted to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I'm going to hand it back over to Carlo.
Thank you so much, Teresa. A huge virtual round of applause to you for that Herculean effort. It is not easy to do a webinar that's an hour and a half long all by yourself. So thank you so much for all of that wonderful information. So we have about 5 minutes left. There have been a few questions that have come in through the chat, which I can highlight for you, Teresa. And then there are also a couple of interesting comments. So if we have time, I'd like to also just spotlight those comments as well. There was one direct question about checking a survivor's credit history. I tried to answer it generally in the chat box. But the question has to do with the survivor that only has an ITIN number, so no Social Security number, but a tax identification number. How can they check their credit history using an ITIN?
That is a great question. I got this information from one of our advocates that specializes in financial advocacy, so I do not have the direct answer to that. However, we partner with a financial literacy organization that assists all of our participants to do a credit check. So I would reach out to some of your, any resources in your community that specialize in financial and credit history. There's also a great resource. It's called Hispanic Solutions, and it's a woman who's based out of here in Minnesota that specifically is reaching out to the Latino community to build information. She has a YouTube channel, though, with a lot of great information on credit that she shares with the broad community. So I would definitely look into working with a credit specialist and financial specialist in terms of how to find out a credit score based on ITIN.
Great. Are there links to resources or websites that people can take a look at to get started? Maybe we could include that in our resources if we can come up with some information for folks. Would that work, Teresa?
Yes, yeah, I can look into that resource too and see if it is Minnesota specific, but I believe just because it's credit, it should apply to many communities. So I'd be happy to include that link in our resource list.
Great. The part that you talked about creative advocacy, I just loved. I mean, it was so practical and so creative, and it sounds like it's worked in many different situations where you and your colleagues have advocated for access to housing for survivors and also helping them maintain housing. One of the participants was wondering if you could talk more about, you talked definitely quite a bit about the open houses for landlords, but sort of like what that was like. Were the landlords happy to be there? I know I've done trainings for landlords about domestic violence, and they're like, oh God, we're just here because we have to be here, but we don't want to be here. But sort of in that context as well, you know, you talked about champion landlords, which is great, but I feel like a lot of us here have had experiences with really difficult landlords. So if you have any advice about how to work with landlords that might not be responsive or don't really want to reach out.
Yeah, so, and it wasn't, Casa Esperanza has not hosted open houses yet, I'll say, but one of our partner agencies, it's called Women's Advocates. They are actually the organization that had the very first domestic violence shelter in the U.S. Based out of here in St. Paul, Minnesota. They are the ones who, they have some specific funding to work in the housing area right now, and that is where they have started to create these open houses. The feedback I've gotten from them is that they've been positive. I'm sure it is growing. So I think they probably kept a very small target number for open houses, and for them specifically, it was not. For any landlords, it was not obligatory. However, I'll give you the example too. I'm working with our coordinated entry system, and we have a survivor service provider work group that works under our coordinated entry leadership committees to inform them. And out of that leadership committee, we also, one of the agencies volunteered to lead sort of a domestic violence, training for HUD-funded housing programs in our continuum of care on the interconnectedness of domestic violence and homelessness. And that has been super successful. They have now done 4 trainings. We did 2 in the fall in October in Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and they just finished another 2 this month. That was open to advocates, to managers, to HUD-funded program staff, and those we really worked with our coordinated entry system as a, we didn't go so far as to say a requirement, but knowing that it is for the coordinated entry system a best practice for all of these staff to be getting trained on these issues and to have training included in our curriculum for assessors, for housing providers on domestic violence. So that is something we have definitely pioneered and has been really great. And actually the response has been very, very positive. So yeah, even sometimes when you get staff there that are like, I don't want to be here, I already know about this. Most people have, all their survey results show that people have left learning new things, and only a small handful are really like, I already knew this, or I didn't learn anything new. And then identifying champion landlords that, I think this can look really creative just based on your community and who you're collaborating with. I've thought about it would be great if your coalition, so our coalition, for example, Minnesota, does awards on an annual basis at their annual conference. And, I think that would be an opportunity for other coalitions or other local collaborations to come together and formalize it, right? Identify those people publicly or write an op-ed about how great it is to be able to partner with landlords, as saying just kind of work different networks, right? And lift up those who are really supporting survivors in the community, because then that partnership can lead to more opportunities and more possibilities in the future.
That's really great advice. Thank you so much, Teresa. We are past time right now, so we are going to go ahead and end the webinar. A reminder that an evaluation is going to pop up as soon as this webinar ends, so just sort of stay tuned to get to that evaluation to complete it. You can also request a certificate of completion at that point. So a huge thank you once again to Teresa Burns at Casa de Esperanza, and thank you to you all who work with survivors every day. You are a very important part of the cause and the movement, and we so appreciate you all. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Have a wonderful rest of your day.